Hello, everyone. In this video, I'll be walking us through completing a psychosocial history. To begin, a psychosocial history basically provides you with information that allows you to understand the client's history and the different domains of their life. So as you can see in the list that's here, you're placing the client in their wider context by asking them questions in order to help you understand how they're functioning in various different areas of their lives. For example, at school, at work, with their families, social life, and so on. And so the psychosocial history will have a component with some questions to ask for each of these life domains so that you can consider the person in context. This information is best obtained through a narrative interview because it's more open-ended and allows the client to give a richer amount of information as opposed to just checking something off on a list or in a self-report, which is more limiting. And so you'll see that the questions we use in the psychosocial history are much more open-ended and broad. So tell me about your school life, tell me about how things are at home, and then elaborating based on what the client tells you. The nice thing about the psychosocial history is that while you're asking questions and listening to what the client is telling you, you're both gathering really important information and also building rapport with the client because they are telling you their story and they are seeing that you're listening and that you care and that you're curious, which feels good and helps to really start to set a foundation for that therapist-client relationship. The other thing that the psychosocial history will achieve is that it'll help you to understand where you need to assess a little bit further. If the client tells you that things are going relatively well at school, that perhaps is going to be an area you focus on a little bit less. Whereas if they tell you that at home, their depression, for example, is really causing some problems or has started to affect their relationship, you're going to assess there further and likely integrate some of that into your treatment goals in order to address those issues. It'll tell you that this depression, for example, is causing relational issues, and that is something that you should address in your treatment goals. When you're conducting a psychosocial history interview, what you're going to want to do is rely really heavily on open-ended questions. As opposed to, do you have problems at home? You're going to broaden that out with an open-ended question, like, tell me about your home life. What does a typical day look like for you? Tell me about your relationship with your siblings and questions like that. This is going to allow the client to really go in the direction that feels the most relevant to them, and they're going to share the information that is the most salient to them. It also allows the client to use their own words in explaining things to you so that you don't lead them in a particular direction that may be influenced by your own biases. Going back to the depression example, perhaps you think that people that have depression always have issues with their relationships. So you might be tempted to ask a leading question like, tell me how your depression has negatively impacted your relationship. Well, that would be a leading question and is a bit biased. So a more open question like, tell me about your relationship, or tell me about any differences or changes you've noticed in your relationship since you started feeling this way, would be a bit better. Then when the client gives you some information, like they say, I've been really struggling at school, for example, you then use follow-up questions to get more elaboration and more explanation. So could you tell me more about the problems you say you're having at school? Okay. You want to let the client be free-flowing in their sharing of information so that it feels like a natural conversation as opposed to an interrogation. Instead of saying, okay, tell me about school. Okay, tell me about this. Okay, tell me about that. You want to kind of be led by the client and go in the direction that they're going. So this is where it's really helpful to be really familiar with your assessment tool so that if they start off talking about school, but then they move into work, for example, you already know your work questions come later and you can start to fill those things in as they speak naturally, as opposed to saying, oh, wait, we're going to get to work later, and interrupting the flow of information and being a bit insensitive. So by having a good familiarity with the information you're looking for and with your assessment tool, you can let the client speak naturally, ask questions for elaboration, and let it flow in that way while still getting the information that you need to get. And then when you get to those employment questions you were saving, you've probably already addressed them and you can move on to something else. Yeah, that's what I want to share about that one. Okay, I've already mentioned this very briefly, but be mindful of interview bias. So we make judgments, we are human, and when the client enters your office, you are likely already making judgments or assumptions about them. You want to keep those in check and make sure that you don't let them lead the interview. You want to be open, use open questions, check your values, check your biases, and make sure that the client doesn't feel judged by you, okay? You also want to be mindful from only gathering information from one source. So in most cases, the bulk of information we get from a client is going to be from the client, right? And that's true of the psychosocial history and everything else. But whenever possible, it is helpful to get information from other sources. So for example, if you're working with a child, getting information from their parents could be very useful. So if you have that opportunity and you can get a release of information signed, that's always helpful, and it's going to give you a bit more of an unbiased perspective on what's actually going on for the client and which areas of their lives are being affected by their symptoms. A child, for example, may not want to tell you about their school problems, but the parent is likely very aware and can give you more detail. Okay, so how do we gather a psychosocial history? I've already mentioned that open-ended questions are best, but even within open-ended questions, there are structured and unstructured interviews. So the unstructured interview is a lot more free-flowing and allows you to do some of what I was talking about regarding letting the client kind of flow and go where they want to go with the assessment, with you kind of just leading where appropriate and adding or asking elaborating questions. That would be unstructured. So you have a kind of a list of things you want to get to, but how you get to them and when you get to them is a bit more free-flowing. These are nice because they let you get a lot more detail from the client, things that you might miss if you were sticking to a clear script, and it allows the client to use their own words. But some limitations, it's not the most reliable or valid version of an interview, and your biases may come out a little bit more. So the alternative is a structured interview. There are some different structured interviews. Some are longer, some are shorter, but these basically provide you with a script or an interview list of questions, if you will, that guides the interview and tells you exactly what to say and which follow-up questions to ask if necessary. So these, of course, are more reliable, more valid. They reduce the likelihood of making an inaccurate diagnosis or missing a diagnosis. And they're going to be consistent across every client that you see, so that reduces some of the bias. But of course, the limitations, you are basically stuck to the questions that you have for the most part, if you're really sticking to the structured interview, and that may make you miss some things that you would have gotten if the client were allowed to kind of free flow a little bit more in the interview. Of course, you can kind of do a combination of these to use a structured interview, but as you're seeing things emerge that are interesting, asking more follow-up questions and going off script a little bit. So don't think that you have to do one or the other. And there is also the complaint that structured interviews tend to interfere with rapport building, which would make sense if it does feel more stringent and focused in this way. The client may not feel like you're listening, or they may feel like you're just there to kind of check off boxes and get answers. So just some things to keep in mind. Okay, now we're going to focus in a little bit to a Department of Mental Health psychosocial history, which comes off of the adult full assessment or the initial assessment. And this is section section 7 of the DMH intake assessment. So the information that I'll be going over is specific to that assessment, but the questions are still useful and helpful if you're wanting to use them, even though you're not doing DMH work. So first, the first section that you'll encounter here is the education or school history. And you'll see up at the top that it gives you two checkbox areas, one to check off special education and one to check off learning disabilities. If the client does not have any of these, you would check off no. If they do, you would check off yes, and you would elaborate in the narrative portion. What has their experience in special education been, for example? What kind of learning disability do they have? How is it affecting them? And so on. Each of these sections also gives you some question ideas in italics. So you'll see there, describe motivation, educational goals, literacy skill level, general knowledge skill level, math skill level, school problems, etc. You are by no means restricted to only asking these things, about these things, but these are a good kind of minimum standard to ask about. And you may find that if you say to a client, tell me about your school history or tell me about how your symptoms have affected school, they might not give you very much. And so this gives you some specific things to ask about. And I've also given you some questions here. So special education, does the client have a learning disability? I've already touched on. What's their motivation for learning? Do they enjoy learning? Do they dislike learning? Do they want to learn? What about? So on. What are their educational goals? Do they want to go to college? Do they want to go to a trade school? Do they never want to see a school again? All of that is useful. Progress toward goals if they have them. Special skills, academic or intellectual skills that are helpful. And any problems at school, behaviorally, socially, academically, with authority, and so on. All of those things are really helpful to find out. And you may be thinking that because you have an adult, this isn't relevant anymore, but that's not true. Their experience at school is still important and likely still affects them in some ways. And you may have an adult who's still in school. So these are important things to ask about regardless. So don't just write NA, not applicable. Make sure that you assess. If the client denies any of these, it's helpful to write things like client denies any problems at school at this time, or client reports having no clear educational goals at this time, just to make it clear that you've assessed for it and that you didn't just overlook it. And that'll be true for every section. So I've written out here an example of what you might write in this particular section, and you'll see that I touch on a lot of different things here. I'm not going to read it because y'all know how to read, but it can be helpful to kind of see how it flows like a narrative, how it kind of goes from one idea to the next with transitions where needed, and gives a lot of information. So client has little motivation for school. Why is that? Because she plans to be an influencer and school is not important. But then there are some skills that are helpful to know about, like being organized, multitasking, and so on. So use this to get helpful information for you. Okay, next is employment history. Obviously, if the client has no employment history, you could write client denies any history of employment, but don't leave it at that. Do they have volunteer experience? What about their employment skills, money management, organization, career aspirations? All of those things can go in here. So again, don't just overlook it and say, well, they don't have a job, they've never had a job, so NA or client denies. There are other things that are listed here that are important. Military service goes here. Any financial issues or financial successes could go here. And ultimate career aspirations or goals also can go here. So even though I wrote about the clients wanting to be an influencer in my education history because it was relevant there, I could elaborate more on that here. What exactly does that look like? When did the client develop that career aspiration? How does that aspiration motivate the client? All of that would be useful information. And don't forget the check boxes here. So are they currently employed? Yes, no, unable to assess, and then military service, yes, no. Okay. Just a quick reminder, as you're going through these sections, be mindful of things that you'll want to follow up on, things that might affect your diagnosing. So if a client's telling you that they've left their jobs several times and they struggle to get along with coworkers, that might be useful information diagnostically. So keep an eye on that and keep it in mind and ask follow-up questions if you need that. All right, here's another sample of what you might write in the employment history. So I have here what the client's doing now, how long she's worked there, she denies any problems, normal relational issues with coworkers, what does the client spend their money on? I have that here. Denies military experience, voluntary work, or previous work experience. Starting to paint a picture of this client's life and what they've been doing. And then as I mentioned, I repeated the career aspiration here with a bit more details. Okay. All right. Next, we move into legal history. This is another one that is often overlooked. If the client's not, there because they're court mandated, folks tend to overlook this and say not applicable, but there are things that are important to write here. So I've listed a couple things: any history of arrest, probation, convictions, deportations, etc. That's all relevant legal stuff. And you don't want to be so skewed by your bias that you look at someone and say, they don't look like they have legal problems, so I'm just going to put no. Make sure you ask, What does someone who looks like they have legal problems look like? So make sure that you ask, have you ever been arrested? Are you on probation, or have you ever been on probation? All of those questions helpful. Any legal proceedings, domestic violence issues, restraining orders, assault, child custody orders, child support issues, all of that goes here and is relevant. If you have a client who has a restraining order against someone, this is helpful for you to know in the event that this person ends up trying to show up at your office or something, right? If the person has child-related legal issues like child support or custody agreements, that might be helpful for you to know because it probably brings some stress with it, right? Or if they ever wanted to bring their child to therapy with them, you'd need to know these things for consent purposes. So don't overlook it. Current legal status is kind of an iffy one. If you do have a client who's undocumented, you may want to refrain from putting that in your assessment in the event that your records were ever subpoenaed. But follow up with your supervisor, find out what the agency prefers for you to do in that case. Right. Here's another example here, legal history. Client denies present or past legal problems, explains that parents are divorced and have remarried. This would cue to me, knowing this, if this person were a minor, they're not, but if they were, I'd want to check the custody agreement to see who needs to be providing consent in this case, unless the client is self-referring. And you see that I have more information on that here because I'm a dutiful therapist and I follow my ethical duties. So per custody record, client's mother has sole legal and physical custody. Then I also included here, to get back at the idea of getting multiple sources, the client reports that she's never had any arrests or altercations with police. However, during session with mother reported that client has been arrested once for DUI. This is helpful for me to know and something that I wouldn't have known if I didn't have a second source, or if I did one of those things where, oh, the client doesn't look like they have any issues, so I'm not going to ask. Right? Make sure you ask. Don't be skewed by your bias. All right, next, current living arrangement. This is where do they live now? Who's there? What's the condition of the house? Have they moved a lot? Any safety concerns? This may be one of your first areas where you're screening for possible neglect or abuse. So this is an important one. Again, there's some cues up at the top: living setting, problems at setting, community, religious, government agency, or other types of support, etc. Okay, so at the very minimum, where does the client live and who else lives there? I would expand that by asking, what's the neighborhood like? Does the client live in an affluent neighborhood where there's a lot of resources? Are they living in an impoverished neighborhood where perhaps safety is an issue? Those are important things to know. Think about in the future when you're starting to put together potential like coping skills or community engagement interventions that you're going to want to implement. It'll be helpful to know if these are even accessible to the client. So you're starting that work now. This all is going to inform your diagnosis, your goals, and your treatment. Don't overlook them. Okay, safety concerns, as I mentioned, both in the neighborhood and in the home, okay? And then sources of support. Is the client involved in a church group, a youth group, a community group? Are they involved in community advocacy? Is extended family involved? All of those things, very helpful to find out. And so you'll see I have some information here, where they live, a little bit about the condition of the home and neighborhood. The client says it's boring because nothing ever happens. Again, I have some more detail from the mother in this case. She says they live in a gated community and it's the safest place to live. Okay, helpful to know. Client reports that she's spiritual, doesn't attend church, but uses yoga and motivation. Definitely something I might utilize in my coping skills building if that's something I was doing, or a relaxation strategy for my interventions, right? At the very minimum, if you're a yoga and meditation person, you just found something to join with your client over, okay? And then I have in the second paragraph some info about social support, has a best friend, doesn't trust other people, but has to act friendly around everyone else. Helpful for you to know as you're building the relationship with the client. She may have issues trusting you, so how can you start to build that trust? A follow-up question here might be, what is it about your best friend that allows you to trust her? Or how did your best friend earn your trust, so that you can start to maybe implement some of those strategies? Okay, so this is helpful information. Current living situation. Dependent care issues. Does the client have any responsibilities related to dependents? If so, write the number of dependent adults. If they don't have any, put 0 so that it shows that you assess. Number of dependent children, same thing. Put 0 if there's none, or write the number of children. This is one area where if the client doesn't have any dependents, then it would be appropriate to write client does not have any dependents, or client reports having no dependents at this time. And then the rest of this section doesn't really apply. But if they do have dependents or they have children, they're asking you here for a lot more detail. Ages of the children, any issues with the children, special needs, home placement issues, and so on would go here. And this is going to help you with gauging stress, perhaps another assessment of neglect or potential abuse, or at the very minimum, how their mental health symptoms have impacted their dependents and their care of the dependents. So in this case, the client doesn't have children, so client does not have any dependents at this time. Don't forget to write the 2 zeros at the top. Okie dokie. Next, we have family history and relationships, which I believe is our last section. And here we're getting at kind of a two-pronged thing. First, we're getting at history of mental illness, drug abuse, and other issues in the family, which may give us some information about why the client presents the way that they do. It may also give us information about where we need to assess further, since we know that some things do tend to be genetic, or at least do influence development. So that's one piece. And then the other piece is assessing for relationships in the family, conflict resolution, emotional safety, things like that. So up at the top, we have some checkboxes: yes, no, unable to assess, for mental illness, alcohol or drug abuse, and incarceration. Okay, any yeses should be elaborated upon in the narrative component. So if you say yes to history of mental illness, what kind of mental illness, in who, and how does the client feel this has affected them, are 3 things that you would definitely want to ask about. For alcohol or drug abuse, same thing. If yes, which substances, which family member, and how has the client been affected? And then incarceration, again, for what, which client, and how has the client been affected, okay? So elaborate on those things here. This is also the point where you may choose to do a genogram. If you're into systems and you want to see kind of the relationships and the boundaries between different family members, a genogram is super helpful. In this case, you'll learn a lot more about doing a genogram when you take family therapy, but there are other resources I can point you to if you have questions. You'll want to find out about how the family handles conflict. And this is one that I already mentioned, but I want to expand a little more. What tends to happen when there's a disagreement or an argument in the home? What happens, and then how is it resolved, if at all? This is important because it may give you an indication of how the client themselves handles conflict in their relationships now, which is likely the same way their family did. So this is helpful to ask about. I'd also ask about what the family does for fun, what their strengths are, what the client likes about their family. Okay, so try not to be too problem-oriented. I do ask about strengths in this case. And I would also ask specifically about relationships with certain members of the family. Yes, there are family scale things that we're assessing for, but we can also do individual relationships. So asking the client what their relationship is with their mother, with their siblings, if there are other people living in the home, with those people, and so on, can be really useful. And then any home safety issues, again, abuse, neglect. If you've already gotten this information in a previous line of questioning, you can just reiterate it here or ask more details as they relate to relationships if you want to, but you wouldn't ask the same question again. That may make the client feel like you weren't listening to them, but you can ask elaborating questions. If that's clear, let me know if that's unclear. Okay, and then here's a sample of family history and relationships. So I have up at the top the history piece. So there's an alcohol issue, a depression issue, and there doesn't seem to be an incarceration issue. So that's the history paragraph there that I've elaborated on as needed. And then the second paragraph here is getting at the dynamics. So how do they handle conflict? How does the client get along with different people in the family, and so on. This can be a very lengthy section if there's a lot of family history stuff. And if you need to, you can always add another, like an addendum to have more space if you run out of space. Okay. All right. So that's it for the psychosocial history section of the DMH assessment. We'll be getting into the other sections in subsequent videos. Thank you for listening. Let me know if you have questions or if there's anything you need elaboration on.